So this morning, we're going to be doing a new sin for our Studying Sin Seriously class, and this morning we're going to talk about drunkenness. And so I think, honestly, when you look at the text, why would you say that if we were going to talk about drunkenness, that it's an iffy topic? Why would you think that's the case? Like someone says, well, there's a lot of gray area to it. Why is that?
Because of the generic way that wine is used in the Bible.
Okay. Mark says on your handout, and everybody has a handout down at the bottom, the Greek word oinos, Mark said, somebody might say there's some gray area because the word oinos is a very generic word, and it does not mean absolutely alcoholic wine. It does not absolutely mean just grape juice. You always have to determine by the context. Let's look for one more idea. And so Mark basically is referencing someone who's at least doing word studies. I'm looking for someone who is religious. They're not doing word studies, but they're going to say, this is a little gray area.
Because I think a person would just say, well, what constitutes drunkenness? Like, where is that line?
Mm-hmm.
So somebody might say, well, I might be a little affected by alcohol per se, but I'm not drunk.
And so basically, Ian says, someone says, he defined one of the ideas of gray area, what constitutes drunk, but the only reason they're saying that is what? They want to drink. There's all kinds, I'm saying there's several things inside the Bible classes that we've gone over where everyone will acknowledge, yeah, that's either a sinful activity, it's a sinful attribute to have of yourself, and nobody argues that. Why? Because they don't really, like if we're basically making a, like we said, envious. No one wants to be envious. We would rather be satisfied. We would like the idea of being content. We don't always necessarily want to put somebody else down. So everybody agrees, yeah, it's bad to be envious. But when you start looking at drunkenness, the reason that the grayness comes up and someone says it's a bit iffy is because there's either they want to do it, they know somebody who is involved in it, and they're basically trying to make a way for that individual. So one thing I'd like to say, just for your handout, we're not going to go through all these in class because there's so many of them. But I always like to make this point with people. The first time, Mark said the word is generic, wine. That's true. But the first time you look at in Genesis 9, 21, 24, it's the first time we will ever see the word wine in the Bible. It is obviously alcoholic wine. It says he has a vineyard, Noah has a vineyard. He becomes drunk with his wine, and he basically passes out in his tent. But our number one here is the first mention of wine in the Bible played a role in sexual sin. The first time you see wine in the Bible, it is negative. I don't know exactly what his son did to him. James?
You talking about Abraham?
No, I'm talking about Noah. Noah got off the ark. They do offer sacrifice right after they get off the ark, but shortly after that in chapter 9, he has a vineyard and he gets drunk off of his own produce from the vineyard. So there's several lists here. There's about 12 ideas of negativity that goes with alcohol. So now we said one reason of gray area. Either they're doing it themselves, they know somebody who they is drinking and they're trying to take up for them in a little bit. They're saying, Ian said, what constitutes drunk? So someone might say, well, I know my friend Ted, he likes to drink a little bit, but I don't know if Ted's out there getting drunk. So what is another reason, basically people's perception of drinking? Why is it they would say, well, it's not so bad? And think of ways of how we get our perceptions.
It's not so bad.
Mm-hmm.
First thing I thought about was when Paul told Timothy to drink a little wine for his stomach.
Right. So we would look at that and somebody would say, well, it's okay to use it medically, and we'll talk about that at the end of the class. And so, we would have to say, someone advocating, Timothy has a problem with his stomach, so Paul says use a little wine for your stomach's sake. I think it's a bit different than Paul telling, Timothy, Titus, let's all meet up at the bar and we'll drink after we go door knocking. I think that's a little bit different. But this is one thing that I think, and I reference this all the time. This was like late 80s, early 90s, and it went for like 11 or 13 years. Cheers. Ian and I were in the car, and I don't know what he was saying exactly. I know, but he was talking about somebody going to a bar. And my response is, well, that's where you go and you get good advice. And he just looked at me, and I said, cheers. So Ted Danson is the bartender who does not drink, so he's always ready to give people the solid advice. And so what I say is, what is unrealistic about Cheers? If y'all never watched it, then that's fine. I'll just say it. Nobody's ever fighting inside of Cheers. Everyone's always in a good mood. Everyone's always, they have one person who's bad, but then everybody else is usually polite with each other. Like, they always come back, and they just keep these good relationships. And so, I know Cheers is probably not too big right now. But anyway, it's on a lot of streaming services. But then I would say this is the more realistic picture. So, now who knows about... Man, you reference these movies and nobody knows what they are. So, have y'all seen Urban Cowboy? Urban Cowboy. That's more realistic. The girl's getting beat up in a bar. And then you basically have, does everybody know what the song is famous for from Urban Cowboy? Looking for love in all the wrong places. I think this is more realistic, but I don't think as many people are watching that. And then when you basically Google etiquette at bars, number 2, make things not to do at a bar. Make a scene after being cut off. So that basically tells you that is what you're going to be seeing. You're going to be seeing a lot of people making a scene. Why? Because they're in there drinking too much. And then point number 3, when you're in the bar, don't harass the bartender. If these are in the top 3 out of 9, then this basically says these are the things that you're going to be seeing. Unpleasant atmosphere. Now here's this one that I am going to show you is like real time. This is a highly followed media group. It's called Barstool Sports. They do report on a lot of sporting events, and then they just talk about going to bars. They did a 9-minute interview with all their staff employees, and they said last time Barstool Sports employees puked at a bar. And it's like they go all around talking to them, and the follow-up question is, when's the last time you puked at a bar? And then they think about it, and they say, this is when. And then he says, when's the last time you were kicked out of a bar? And he said, probably when I puked in the bar. Everybody's getting kicked out. Everybody had a story about puking in there. In any other circumstances, these would not be categorized as good time. Getting kicked out, puking, things like that. We went to Six Flags with Tanner when Dad went to Chicago to get a hernia operated on, and I stopped having fun once I threw up. I don't categorize that as oh, that was so much fun. No, it was fun until then. But you see, we just have this wrong perception, and it's given to us from every which way. So this is what I would like to, leaving that aside, how everything's presented to us, let's start having the real conversation about it. The Christian and alcohol. So, in your handouts, we said the first mention that you have of wine is negative. Consistently, the idea is going to be negative. And so, I really think that as we look at the list of scriptures that we have, 1 Corinthians 6, verses 9 through 10, I know that someone's going to say, we're going to talk about it. But someone would say, well, this is not confusing, Caleb, because that's drunkards. You have to be a full-blown alcoholic to be in this category with all the other sinful activities. Galatians 5:19 through 21. Again, sinful activities, and then you have drunkenness. And Ephesians 5:18, someone would say this. He says, be not drunk with wine. Somebody would say, there's the word drunk. And then after that it says, wherein is excess, but be filled with the Spirit, Ephesians 5:18. So I think that based on the information that we're going to look at, it's a very clear, cut and dry thing that the Christian should be abstaining from recreational alcohol, not just the idea of you don't get drunk, but that we should be trying to avoid it as best as we can in multiple circumstances. And so we're going to have scriptures to look at this morning. And so when we put these up, 3 different scriptures in the New Testament. So let's talk about this. When you use Proverbs talks about abstaining from alcoholic wine. What's somebody going to say? We have on the screen, they say, yeah, but.
That's Old Testament.
That's the Old Testament. Well, here we've got 3 solid cases from the New Testament, and they still say, yeah, but. And it's going to be the issue of social drinking, recreational drinking is not drunkenness. And so, aside from, let's say it this way, what's one of the, like for you, you're trying to talk with somebody about social drinking, you're trying to talk about this topic with them. What is advantageous for you to do in the discussion? And what, let's say it this way, you have this down before you even begin the discussion with them.
One thing will be to show the detrimental side of it.
Okay. Show the detrimental side of it. We're going to get there in just a moment. But okay, Ian.
How do you find a limit?
Okay, how do you find a limit? This is what we're going to look at. The question that I asked will be answered in just a moment. But we'll say this before we get to the question. Asking them, Ian said, how do you find a limit? With Mark said, show them all the negativity. Even with all the negativity, someone says drinking is okay, drunkenness is the problem, but then I have to say to them, the only way to avoid this particular sin is to first commit it so that you know your limit and then never do it again. So, like, Mark and Ian, they're big dudes. I think that you take a smaller male, it would take less for them to get drunk, and then basically somebody says, well, I drink this, whereas Mark and Ian, they're going to be drinking a stronger substance. So basically, then what else do you have to do? Not only do you have to get drunk to find out your limit, what do you have to do with the drinks? Are you always just going to be straight drinking the same thing, or are you going to have to then start testing all the different beverages? Like, I watched some news story one time, I think it might have been How to Catch a Predator, and they said one of the things that these people will do with like young, underage people, is they said they'll offer these kids wine coolers. And I'm like, okay, that doesn't mean a thing to me. But they said wine coolers because it's appealing to the kids because it looks like a fruity, tasty drink. But actually, wine coolers have some of the highest alcohol content of all these alcoholic drinks. So you're going to have to test your limit on all these different beverages. What other sin is that way? We know these different things that we should be avoiding. We don't have to say, well, I need to dabble in a little bit before I can get to know it. Now, here's the question I was going to say. It's advantageous, Mark said, show them the negativity, but I would say it's advantageous to know where they're going to be going. So that's what we're going to do this morning. We're going to look at portions of Scripture that the other side would like to use to justify social drinking rather than just going full-blown into this is why it would be wrong. And so, like we said, the Proverbs is going to clearly give discussion on it. Wine is a mocker. Strong drink is raging, and whosoever is deceived thereby is not wise. So, Solomon, who we would say is the wisest king, gave this information by inspiration that whosoever is deceived thereby is not wise. So, you're talking with somebody and they say, well, and honestly, I'll have another illustration that Ian will basically have to give, but this is what I'm saying. Someone says, well, drinking doesn't equal drunk, and Solomon says whoever is deceived thereby is not wise. So, how little will the government let you get by with driving your car and having drunk alcohol?
It's roughly 1 per hour, and that depends on the alcohol content of the beverage.
Okay, I've never heard it put that way.
So the reason is your body can only process so much at a time.
Yeah.
So they say if you have a beer, that puts you just below the threshold where you can safely operate a vehicle according to the government.
Yeah.
If you have any more than 1 per hour, then you push yourself above that limit, and you're no longer considered safe to operate a motor vehicle.
Okay. That's it. 0.08.
I'm going to get further with that. If you are carrying a gun, you can't even take a sip of any alcohol beverage.
Yeah. Okay. So, they obviously deem operating the gun heavier than operating the motor vehicle. So, Ian, I've always just heard straight 0.08, which does not take a lot to get to. And the way that Ian says that you basically calculate that out is they calculate it out is you can only have 1 beer per hour. And then Tanner says, and if you're someone who's carrying a gun, you can't even drink the alcohol. So I don't think that it's ridiculous to then say, when he says whoever deceived thereby, how much does it take to basically lower our mental faculties? Well, if you got a gun, can't have any of it. If you're driving a car, you can only have one beer within the hour. And then you look at Proverbs 23, 29, and 32, he says up here, who's deceived by it, and we basically know, we see that it doesn't take much. And the thing that I was going to say was, Ian basically has a account where he was studying with somebody, and they were drinking. And like, Ian is there because he wants to have real, serious conversation. How did that go?
So the intent was to, before I left Texas, I wanted a chance to talk to my Baptist boss. And we'd had a little bit of discussion before, but the idea was before I leave, I want to make sure that we go over whether or not this individual is saved. And he agreed to meet me to have this discussion. And the place that we met at, the first thing he did was he bought a beer. And I asked him, you're not fixing to get messed up because we're trying to have a conversation. He said, oh, no. He's somebody that drinks all the time. So you would think one beer, a lot of people would say, well, one beer, for instance, you're still safe to operate a motor vehicle, they say. So he's somebody that should have a higher, quote, tolerance. And as we were discussing, after just having that one beer, as he was approaching like the last third of the beer, his temperament changed in the conversation completely, so that he wasn't listening to what I was saying anymore. He wasn't responding in a rational way anymore. Like, it completely changed the tone of the conversation. That's why I realized this is a fruitless endeavor.
Yeah. So one thing that I thought of while you were saying that too is, so Ian says he's going to sit down and have a serious Bible conversation with someone that he knew in Texas, and the first thing the other person does is he orders a beer. And as he drinks that beer and the conversation goes on, Ian says that man's mental faculties just notably go downhill. Well, one thing that Ian said is, we have these conversations, what is the other side going to continuously do as we bring up these illustrations? We're going to say, the government says you can't even drink alcohol and be carrying a gun. You only have one beer within the hour. And then the way Ian said that was, this person is someone who does drink a lot, so you would think they have a lot of tolerance. What's the other side going to do? They're always going to be moving their standards. So when Ian says this is someone who normally would drink a lot and you think they have a lot of tolerance, and then they say, well, what do you think is a lot? I drink a lot. And it's like, we're never going to one-up them on that side. So this is basically where we ought to come back and say, look, nothing we say in that realm is going to be good enough. Ian will say, well, I knew somebody and this is how it went. And they'll say, well, Ian, that's just your one friend. That's not everybody. Well, we actually have to do business with people who, like, they haven't even left the office yet. Just the different people that we're working with, 5 o'clock hits, they're drinking in the office. And it's like, it's notable. They don't pay attention. They're super, scattered. So, but then someone says, okay, that's just who y'all know. Okay, look at this. How would you avoid being deceived? Solomon says, don't even look at it. Who has woe? Who has sorrow? Who hath contentions? Who has babbling? Who has wounds without cause? Who has redness of eyes? They that tarry long at the wine, they that go to seek mixed wine, look not thou upon the wine when it is red, when it gives its color in the cup, when it moves itself aright. At the last it bites like a serpent, and stings like an adder. So, here he's saying, don't even look at it. It gives all this different trouble, but here's what the other side is going to say. They'll hear us say all these points, and then the other side will say back to us, yeah, but Paul said in Romans 14, verse number 17, the kingdom of God is not meat and drink, but righteousness and peace and joy in the Holy Ghost. And they'll take that verse, and they will use Romans 14, and it is the case that in Romans 14, what does Paul say about meat that's offered to idols?
You don't eat.
Well, does he say it's inherently wrong? He says it's just meat. So somebody's going to come to Romans 14 and they're going to say, look, some people had a problem with that meat they were eating. And Paul says, it's no big deal. And they'll say back to us, they'll say, we recognize that y'all don't like social drinking. You don't like recreational drinking. But that's just your problem. Let's look at Romans 14:21. It is good neither to eat flesh, nor to drink wine, nor anything whereby thy brother stumbleth, or is offended, or is made weak. But this is also what he says in this context. In Romans 14, he says, we know that an idol is nothing, and the meat that's offered to an idol, he says it's just meat. It doesn't harm one way or another. But what does he actually say about himself? He says, if this meat hurts my brother's conscience, what does he say that he'll do? He says, I won't eat the meat then. So wouldn't it actually work backwards against the people who are saying, Romans 14? If they're going to say, y'all just have a conscience problem with drinking, but there's really nothing wrong with drinking. If that's the route they want to go down, what have they just done to themselves? Based on Romans 14, they would then have to stop drinking because it would be affecting our fellowship. And that would be a whole other thing too about it. Somebody uses Romans 14 and they say, well, Paul said that it's nothing to eat, it's nothing to drink, and you guys just have a conscience problem. Well, he says I wouldn't eat the meat, so why wouldn't I ask them back the question, does that mean y'all are going to stop drinking the alcohol? But here's the other thing. Is that really something that if they thought that drinking alcohol recreationally was okay, that's something that they're willing to sever fellowship with a whole section of the church? I don't see why they would do that. If we basically say we have a collective mission to reach people who are not saved at all. I realize there are Christians, and they're real Christians, but they're in error on this point. They think that it's okay to drink. Why would they not want to say, hey, we need to have as much fellowship as we can so that we can reach so many more people? Well, maybe that's going to be a symptom of a bigger problem. So let me stop here real quick. Does this point make sense? Romans 14 is the idea. They say that for our end, we should recognize it's only our conscience, and our response back to that is, well, if you're going down that route, you have just admitted you shouldn't be doing it for our conscience sake. So let's look at one more. Here's another point for Romans 13. In Romans 14, now let's make a point with your handout. For the word oinos, like Mark said, it's a generic word. It doesn't always mean alcohol. It doesn't always mean grape juice. It just has to be determined by the context. So let's look at this in Romans 14. Somebody presents the idea to you. They say, well, number one, they say, I can drink and not get drunk. And then number two, they say, that's just your conscience problem, but you shouldn't be talking to us about your conscience problem. Let's look at Romans 13 and 14 before you get to Romans 14. Before you get into chapter 14, which I recognize I didn't have the chapter divisions, but Paul says, let us walk honestly as in the day, not in rioting and drunkenness, not in chambering and wantonness, not in strife and envying. And then he says in verse 14, but put you on the Lord Jesus Christ and make not provisions for the flesh to fulfill the lusts thereof. So in verse 13, the other side that's promoting social drinking, they're going to say, see, there it is, Caleb, there's drunkenness again. Well, we're not talking about getting drunk. But then my point in verse number 14 is where he says, make no provisions for the flesh to fulfill the lusts thereof. What are you doing as you drink the alcohol?
Lowering inhibitions.
Okay, let's say you go into it with resolve. I'm not going to get drunk. But as you drink, your resolve is going down. So you are making provisions for the flesh to fulfill the lust thereof. It's not like, and I'm saying there's another Proverbs too, where the proverb writer would say, he basically would say about sin, you're taking fire in your hand and putting it in your bosom. He says there's no way you won't get burned. And that's what's going on here. It's like you think I'm going to control fire and put it in my bosom. Ian.
I knew a guy who used to say, in terms of like knowing when you're actually passing that threshold and the idea that you're going to recognize it even as you're putting alcohol into your system. I knew a guy who used to say that the way that he would recognize that he was like full-on drunk is that his drink started tasting like water again. So it's like, if you're not recognizing, you have to put like things in place to try to figure out, am I over the line or not? It's not like this obvious thing where, okay, I'm there, I'm at my threshold.
Yeah. So, even if you have determined in the past, this is my line, it's not always going to be super distinguishable. Yeah, okay. So, here's our point for Romans 14. If they say, well, it's just like the meat, it's your conscience problem. If that's the route they want to go down, they have just put themselves in a situation where they should have to stop doing it basically to appease our consciences. And then Romans 13 and 14, I cannot imagine that Paul says, avoid drunkenness and don't make provisions for the lust of the flesh, and then he just goes on to excuse drinking alcohol, when he just said, don't even make a provision for it. So, then this is the next one. We're moving on now. This is like, everyone knows this one. John 2, Jesus is at the wedding feast, and he turns water into wine. So, when we went to the Episcopalian church in Danville, they were having their pub night, and they had hired this man to come in and play live music for them. We asked him, we said, are you a member here? And he said, no, I'm not a member here. They just hired me to come play music. And so I said, are you religious? And he said, not too much. And I said, well, let me just ask you a question. I'll get you on, the whole conversation. So he's unloading all of his stuff, and I said, don't you think it's kind of backwards? I said, you're not a religious fellow, but don't you think it's backwards that you're coming to a church to play live music and they're going to be having, quote, pub night? And he kind of thought about it, and he said, didn't Jesus make wine? And then he just, walked off. I would have loved to have talked to him about it, but he just walked away. So here's your text in John 2, 6 through 11. There were set there 6 water pots of stone, after the manner of the purifying of the Jews, containing 2 or 3 firkins apiece. Jesus said unto them, fill the water pots with water, and they filled them up to the brim. And he says unto them, draw out now, and bear unto the governor of the feast. And they bare it. And when the ruler of the feast had tasted the water, that they made wine, and knew not whence it was, but the servants which drew the water knew, the governor of the feast called the bridegroom, and said unto him, every man at the beginning does set forth good wine, and when men have well drunk, then that which is worse. But thou hast kept the good wine until now. This beginning of miracles did Jesus in Cana of Galilee, and manifested forth his glory, and his disciples believed on him. So you have 2 elements in here, 2 words that have to be discussed. Wine, and then where he says down in verse number 10, when the men have well drunk. So, what is the problem for the other side? They say, well, Jesus made wine in John 2. What are the problems they're going to run into?
If there was alcoholic wine and Jesus was serving alcoholic wine to men that are already well drunk, then he's contributing.
Okay, they have really killed themselves. Let's look at this. Well drunk, verse number 10, that's a very big deal. We really need to be paying attention to well drunk in verse number 10. But now let's talk about this the way that Mark said it. These are people who are already consuming. So you saw in the text it says, where is it? Verse number 6, containing 2 or 3 firkins apiece. A firkin is about 9 gallons, and they had 6 of these pots, and the pots had 2 or 3 firkins apiece. So this is what this means. The people had already drank 108 to 162 gallons of wine, and then Jesus gives them another 108 to 162 gallons of wine. And so like Mark said, if they've already consumed this much and somebody says, yeah, well, it's a whole group of people. If you have consumed 108 to 162 gallons of alcoholic wine, and now Jesus is giving you even more alcoholic wine, the end result is that he would be participating in drunkenness, not just social drinking. And that's their whole thing. I can drink without getting drunk. At this point, people are getting drunk, and Jesus provided the whole means for it. So you have to know that's not what's going on here. For them to have consumed all this beforehand and then given more afterwards would have to be the case that he was not giving them alcoholic wine. Now, let's just pause, and everybody who has your handout, Betsy, you didn't get one of these, so I can't go anywhere because I'm tied to these microphones. So, Mark, do you know the passage offhand, Isaiah, for wine? 65:8. So everybody, I didn't put it on your paper, but go ahead and write down on your paper on the bottom down here next to oinos, if you put in Isaiah 65:8. Now, someone's going to say Isaiah is not Greek, it's Hebrew, but still look at this point that we're making here. Thus saith the Lord, as the new wine is found in the cluster, and one says, destroy it not, for a blessing is in it, so will I do for my servant's sake, that I may not destroy them all. And the point that we're making here is, what is the juice, like a cluster of grapes, what does the juice come out as?
Fresh.
It's just juice. But this text says, wine in the cluster. So we have to see here the word is interchangeable. It can mean just grape juice. Some contexts it can mean use or be used as alcoholic wine. James.
We put old wine in new bottles, and new bottles were bust.
I think that's it's either Matthew 9 or Luke 9. Okay, here's one more point on John 2. To show that they were not consuming alcoholic wine. When they have already consumed all of their wine, the governor says back to Jesus, everybody puts out the best first, and they save the worst for later. He says, but you have saved the best for last. Well, we're going to know the governor, the ruler of the feast, was not drunk because he was able to distinguish what they had before from what was better now. And Ian said a moment ago that his friend said, the more I drink, the more it just tastes like water. And that's how I tell. Well, this person could, after drinking with everybody, is able to say, this is better than what we had beforehand. That's right. They still have all their senses. They're not having alcoholic wine. So here's another one. We put up Isaiah 65:8. Let's look at this one really quick. Habakkuk 2:15. Woe unto him that gives his neighbor drink and puts the bottle to him and makes him drunken also, that thou may look on their nakedness. Now someone might say, Habakkuk 2:15, they want to narrow it down. Is it okay to get your neighbor drunk for any other reason than to see his nakedness? It's still wrong. Like someone wants to be super narrow on Habakkuk 2:15. Someone says, well, Jesus wasn't trying to get people naked. Well, he also couldn't be getting them drunk according to Habakkuk 2:15. He was not giving them alcoholic wine. He was just giving them grape juice for their feast. Now let's look at one more point on well drunk. We're going to move on from John 2 to another scripture that's going to make our point. This is how we're going to move over. So, it just depends on who you're talking to. Like how we can say this. We can say that all Baptists teach that a person is saved and then later on they're baptized. As far as social drinking, I can't say that this group is always going to say it's wrong. I can't say that this group is always going to say it's okay. People are very, very diverse on it. But I will say this. A.T. Robertson is one of the most famous Baptist scholars. And one of the men that my dad debated, A.C. Smith, said about A.T. Robertson, he said A.T. Robertson is the world premier student in the Greek language for the Bible. World premier, world-renowned student of the Greek. And look at what A.T. Robertson says on John 2, verse number 10. The verb well drunk does not mean these guests are now drunk, intoxicated. So you have this man noting they're not getting drunk. We know that the word wine, oinos, it can either way. It can mean alcoholic wine or it can just mean grape juice. And we saw that from Isaiah 65:8. And then on your Greek words, the term well drunk is the Greek word methuo. And it can mean satisfied or filled to the brim. It does not have to mean intoxicated. It can just mean somebody, like you say, I've had my fill. Well, I can have my fill of all kinds of things other than just alcohol. So now let's do this. In John 2, we make this point again. The word wine does not just always mean oinos, does not always mean alcoholic wine. Based on the amount that Jesus gave them, he would have been participating in their drunkenness. And then the next argument is the governor still had all of his senses and was able to distinguish the better from the worse, even after all that previous, quote, wine had been consumed. And we make the point about well drunk. Now let's look at this. Were the Corinthians getting drunk in the assembly? We're talking about the Sunday morning worship assembly. In 1 Corinthians 11, 17 through 22, now in this that I declare unto you, I praise you not, that you come together not for the better, but for the worse. For first of all, when you come together in the church, I hear there be divisions among you, and I partly believe it. For there must also be heresies among you, that they which are approved may be made manifest among you. When you come together, therefore, into one place, this is not to eat the Lord's Supper. For in eating, everyone takes before other his own supper. One is hungry and one's drunk. What? Have you not houses to eat or drink in, or despise ye the church of God, and shame them that have not? What shall I say to you? Shall I praise you in this? I praise you not. Now, somebody would say this: well drunk does not have to mean intoxicated. In verse number 21, is he actually, are there people in the assembly that are full-blown intoxicated? Or is he actually comparing somebody's hungry in verse 21 and somebody is full, like we said, full to the brim? So we have to use this. We have to connect these two for individuals back in John 2:10. If they are going to say in John 2:10 that this is alcoholic wine, and the text says they're well drunk, they're going to have problems. And we're taking away the idea that well drunk does not mean intoxicated over here, which then lends to the idea that they did not have intoxicating wine. And then we come back to 1 Corinthians 11:21. One's hungry and another is drunk. And we ask them the question, is somebody drunk at home or drunk in the assembly? No. One is hungry and one is full to the brim, just like we said that word can be used. Now let's ask this question. If they are intoxicated in the assembly, what is Paul's answer to it?
Praise you not.
Okay, he says, I praise you not. What does he tell them to do after that? If they're drunk in the assembly, what does Paul then say? Don't do it here, do it where? So did Paul actually just justify people getting drunk at home? Because I thought getting drunk was the simple part. See, all these different passages are actually going to mess the folk up who are promoting recreational drinking or social drinking. They're going to look at 1 Corinthians 11:21 and say, well, the problem here is they're doing it in the worship assembly, and Paul says they ought to be doing it at home. He says, what, have you not houses to eat and drink in? But if they're drunk in the assembly and he says, go home and get drunk, that's defeating their whole idea of I can drink without getting drunk. All these different passages, we should be ready, and this is the thing. Let's talk about this. You've got 12 different points on your handout here. Do you think this should be enough? I'm saying let's tie these in with what Proverbs said. Wine is a mocker, whoever is deceived is not wise. Then he tells us in Proverbs 23, don't even look at it. I would like to think that all this negativity attached to consumption of alcohol would be enough. But this is just extra information in case these don't get you very far. To use 1 Corinthians 11 this way, and really, y'all, this is the thing. When you're doing this type of discussion with somebody and the other side says, well, you're confusing me right now. We're not confusing them. They're getting confused in their own position. They're going to look at 1 Corinthians 11:21 and say, well, the problem is that they're drinking in the assembly. Well, what does Paul say the answer is? To be drunk at home. Well, you can't get drunk. So they're always going to be catching themselves coming and going, and that's the way that we have to do it. The easiest way, if they say, well, you're confusing me. Well, we're not going to be confused. If we basically look at the word and say it means full to the brim, it means they're satisfied while someone else is still hungry. And then he says back to them, you eat and drink in your home. You have these big meals in your homes. I'm not going to use this to justify social drinking or John 2, because if you use John 2, I can get you over in 1 Corinthians 11. So like we said, it's advantageous to know where they're going to go. It's very advantageous to know where these words are. Well, drunk, and drunk in here in 1 Corinthians 11, it's the same word as over in John 2. So we say it this way, does he justify getting drunk in the house? Now, we're about to start wrapping up, but we'll ask this last question on 1 Corinthians 11, the idea of well drunk. What is, when somebody is talking with you and they say the Septuagint or they say the LXX, what is that? Okay, it's Hebrew Old Testament translated into Greek. And then when you do this, so here's what you're doing. The Greek words that we would be using like oinos and methuo in the New Testament, when you have the Septuagint, those Greek words are being plugged back into the Old. Now here's my point. In Matthew 23:5, Psalm. Everybody knows Psalm 23, right? The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He says in Psalm 23:5, Thou preparest a table before me in the presence of my enemies. Thou anointest my head with oil, my cup runneth over. Here, this word or term phrase, runneth over, when you find in the Septuagint, is the same Greek word that is translated well drunk or drunken. Now, is David writing and he says, You prepare my table before me in the presence of my enemies, you anoint me, you anoint my head with oil, and then does he say back to God, You cause me to be drunk? We all know that phrase in the religious community. They say, My cup runneth over. What are they always talking about?
Blessing.
Blessings. And in what fashion? Full of blessings, abundant blessings. So here is methuo, just like it is in 1 Corinthians 11, just like it is in John 2:10, and you take it back to the Septuagint in Psalm 23:5, it has nothing to do with being intoxicated. It's just a word that means to the brim, fully satisfied. It would be good for us to have that written on our handout next to the Greek words. Psalm 23:5 has nothing to do with being intoxicated. It has everything to do with being satisfied or in an abundance. Okay, this is what we'll wrap up with, and this is where one of our first comments, it was said, why the confusion about alcohol? So Ephesians 5:18 says, Be not drunk with wine wherein is excess. And they say that's the problem. That's the problematic part, is the excess, not the drinking, it's the excess. So you'll see the same thing in 1 Peter 4:3 and 4. For the time past of our life may suffice us to have wrought the will of the Gentiles when we walked in lasciviousness, lust, excess of wine, revelings, banquetings, and abominable idolatries, wherein they think it strange that you run not with them, verse number 4, to the same excess of riot, speaking evil of you. So if somebody uses these passages and they say, well, the problem is excess. You can have a little bit of wine, a little bit of alcohol. Well, then I ask them the question in 1 Peter 4:4, is it okay to have a little bit of riot? Is it okay to have a little bit of riotousness? Which is what he says back in Romans 13:13, don't do it. Not rioting as in the night, but he says living as in the day. So, still, we're talking about not even beginning the process. Not making provisions. Well, then you're going to have 1 Timothy 3, where the elder, it says, the elder is not given to wine. So, not at all. Not given to wine. 1 Timothy 3:8, about the deacons, it says, not given to much wine. And when you go over to the book of Titus, it says, for the aged women, that they be in behavior as becometh holiness, not false accusers, not given to much wine, teachers of good things. And then it was brought up, Paul said to Timothy, have a little wine for thy stomach's sake. So, what do you think about the idea where he says in these multiple passages, not much wine? I mean, we've looked at several discussions where you see it's clearly not alcoholic wine at all. And then we've looked at other passages where he says don't even begin the process. So what could be the reasoning here to basically say not given to much wine? Because he's not going to say not given to much grape juice. Right? There's not going to be a problem with you having too much grape juice. So why would he be saying not given to too much alcoholic wine? In Luke 10:34 and Proverbs 31:6, did they not used to use alcohol in medicinal fashions? So I'll say it like, and we all know it. Who had of y'all, or maybe it was done to you, or if you had a baby, did you ever put whiskey on the baby's bottle?
Rubbed it on the skin.
Okay. Rub a little bit of whiskey on your finger, rubbed it on the baby's gums. You put it on the bottle, is that what you're saying? And I know my grandparents did it to my mother, and then she slept the rest of the day, and they thought they had killed her. But then I'm saying, y'all, look at Luke 10:34. This is the Good Samaritan. He went to him. The Samaritan finds this man robbed and left for dead in a ditch. He goes to him, binds up his wounds, pours in oil and wine, and set him on his own beast, and brought him to an inn and took care of him. He's not pouring grape juice in this man's wounds. They're using wine in medicinal fashions. Proverbs 31:6, give strong drink unto him that is ready to perish, and wine unto those that be of heavy hearts. Now, I will say, someone has said this about, well, anytime you're sad, you have a drink. If you're sad, why would it make sense? How does that not make sense to drink if you're already sad? Alcohol is a depressant. Everybody notices that. What do you do with somebody who is on their deathbed? What do we do today? They're on their deathbed.
Morphine.
You give them morphine. Why? Just so that they don't just go. They're going to die. And we basically say, in a gracious way, we're going to give them morphine. That way they don't feel awful as they go out. Now, can Paul look at this, Luke 10:34 and Proverbs 31:6, and say look at this, aged women, look, they're up in age, they're having problems. And he says, in a medical way, yes, it's fine for them to have a little bit of wine for a medical purpose. So let's talk about this. Everybody knows about the baby thing. And so what's the difference, y'all? We had a teacher, and someone in his class, he asked him, he said, is it okay, he said, if I mix a little whiskey and rock candy if I have a cough? And the teacher said, it just depends on how often you have a cough. And so then the other night I was watching this video, and it was Johnny Carson, and a doctor came on with Johnny Carson, and they were talking about steps for the common flu. He said the common flu lasts about 10 days, and it's awful. And he said one of the best things that you can do is, he said, you can mix gin, lemon juice, and maple syrup. He said that's one of the best cough syrups you can make. Now here's my question. Is anybody making their own cough syrup anymore? But when you buy cough syrup, does it not have an alcohol content? What's the difference? See what I'm saying? It's like we have moved it. Well, you shouldn't be mixing gin with maple syrup and lemon juice, but you can have 2 whole servings of NyQuil and we won't have a problem. It's the same thing. Now, that, and then let's have this other question. So, what is it called? Like, what does a doctor do? They blank medicine. Okay, it's another P word. He said they practice medicine. So, they got ideas for everything that a lot of people would say, I don't know about that. And that's why they tell you get a different opinion. So, do you know that a doctor will actually prescribe alcohol to an underage individual who can't sleep? And then that was given to someone who was in high school when they couldn't sleep. And the doctor said, just give him a shot of Jack and he'll go to sleep. Some might say, well, I don't know. I feel like that might get me on a start to some bad behavior later on in life. Do you know what else a doctor can do? You're talking about it might get me started on bad behavior? A doctor can give that advice just as well as saying, I can give you pills that will make you go to sleep. Or I can basically say you do have a problem and you could drink this rather than saying, I don't want to get on these pills either. It's practicing medicine either way. What is the problem that you run into it? Well, the problem you run into with pills is you might start abusing your pills. If they say have a little to drink, you start abusing that. What do you start doing? I don't know. Like someone says you can drink wine for a heart problem. Well, the doctor says have a little bit of alcoholic wine for your heart problem. Then what do you start doing? I kind of got some other problems going on. Maybe wine will fix that too. See, that's the problem. I'm fine to give people their medicinal needs. It's awful to be sick. It's awful to be in pain. I would like to help them out. I think that Paul recognizes that also, and that's why he says, not much, but enough for medicine's sake. One other point, I can't remember it right now. Oh, then I also think there oftentimes will be alternatives too. So what's the old way they said about how to flush out your kidneys? Drink. Okay, that's it. The old saying is you drink a beer, flush out your kidneys. Then you end up flushing your kidneys out 3 or 4 times a day. And then Ian said the alternative is cranberry juice will do it just as well. So that's the whole discussion for Paul and Timothy. Take a little wine for your stomach's sake. So, you know, my father-in-law starts having, now he's not a Christian, but my father-in-law starts having stomach problems. You know what they said to him? You have to stop drinking. I don't know what the term that he had. Do you remember it? But that was one of the first things they said. Dave, you drink a lot of alcohol? You need to stop drinking. So, could he have been prescribing grape juice? Just as well, I think so. So as we conclude this morning, I'm fine to give people a medical pass, right? And someone says, well, if you give them a medical pass, they're likely to start abusing. They can start abusing without a medical pass. People are going to do what they want to do. But I'm fine to give people room as far as a medical purpose. And the other scriptures we looked at, Romans 14, John 2, and 1 Corinthians 11, they do not justify social drinking in any sense. Okay. Questions or comments?
Mark 7:18 is another one now. Go to.
Mark 7:18. He says unto them, are you without understanding also? Do you not perceive that whatsoever thing from without entereth into the man, it cannot defile him? And you're saying they would misuse that?
Yeah.
Okay. It would. They would.
But they wouldn't drink chloride.
That's true. Okay. For your notes, if you want to mark that one down, Mark 7:18, that would be another good one that they would use. I just didn't have it in the slides. Questions, comments? Okay, we'll stop, take a quick break, and then we'll